fired. Let's bring into the conversation right now to discuss the legal ramifications of this. Former federal prosecutor, friend of the program, Neama Rahmani. Neama, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And this is a state case, a local case. It's not federal. What went into that strategy, and could it soon become the feds?
It could absolutely become a federal case, Andy. And state filed first, and we've seen them file first in other cases, notably Luigi Mangione, obviously DeCarlos Brown in Charlotte. There's always the possibility of the Department of Justice filing over the state. Now, that's something that Attorney General Pam Bondi and the local U.S. Attorney's Office will decide. I think one of the big factors they consider is whether that state has the death penalty. Obviously, New York doesn't. That's why they're seeking the death penalty there for Luigi Mangione, who's actually has a court hearing tomorrow in state court as well. And North Carolina, even though they have the death penalty, in theory and practice, they don't, because under state law there, you need a physician present, and the medical board there doesn't allow physicians to be present. So the question is, are we going to see federal charges in the Tyler Robinson case? And I still think we may. When you have the president of the United States, the director of the FBI, the deputy director of the FBI, and the attorney general talking about a case, there is a political layer on top of it. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see federal charges against Robinson as well. That gives the prosecution two bites at the apple. It's not double jeopardy because they're dual sovereigns. And we have seen it in other cases. So it does give the feds two cracks at the death penalty if that's what prosecutors ultimately decide to do.
And let's get into that decision, the kind of conversations that are had about this. And you mentioned that it could be taken up by the federal authorities. Could it be a domestic terrorism case? Is that likely? Are there additional charges that would allow the feds to get involved, persuade them to get involved more?
Andy, that's absolutely right. You need a federal jurisdictional hook. So this wasn't the murder of a federal official or murder on federal property. So you need a federal law that applies to allow you to get into federal court. And I think terrorism is the most likely law that we would be talking about. So an act of violence committed based on one's political beliefs sort of influence the public. You may even get a potential civil rights charge if the murder was committed to really silence Charlie Kirk and his political speech. So I think that's another way to get there. I mean, there are potential interstate components as well, but I'm not sure necessarily any of these apply. Like some other cases we talked about, Brian Koberger, for instance, going from Washington State to Idaho. Seems like this just happened in the state of Utah.
Yeah, of course, Tyler Robinson, the shot happening in Orem, Utah. He was taken into custody there in Washington, Utah, and southern Utah. I do want to ask you about other components because you mentioned the differences between a federal case and a state case. Another component is the fact that there might be cameras inside the courtroom, that it would get even more notoriety. Do you think that is a factor at all?
It's a big factor. So we all know there's no cameras in federal court. That's why we see the courtroom sketches. We saw that over days, for instance, in the Sean Diddy Combs trial. Utah is a state that doesn't really allow cameras in state court either. There are some exceptions in the appeals court. So unlike my home state of California, for instance, we've all seen plenty of cameras in state court here. There aren't usually cameras in Utah state court. So regardless of whether it's state or federal, the case against Tyler Robinson obviously going to be one of the most watched trials in American history because of who the victim was. I don't think we're going to get cameras in this case, Andy.
Even if it is state, no cameras?
No cameras under Utah law, unfortunately. Some states don't have cameras. New York, for instance, generally doesn't have cameras even in New York State court. That's why some of the president's trials were not televised, unfortunately. I'm a big believer in cameras in the courtroom, by the way, but it really is one of those things that each state sets their own laws.
Yeah, and obviously the jurisdiction, all those protocols for different states. So it's interesting to kind of dissect that this happened in that way. And you mentioned also the death penalty, because I think we were talking about it recently with Irina Zarutska there in North Carolina, where the death penalty is on the table, but they haven't used it. The physicians aren't necessarily allowed to do it. In Utah, potentially that is different. Can you explain that at all?
Utah is a death penalty state. They haven't conducted an execution in quite some time, about 15 years or so. So they use lethal injection, and as a backup option, they use the firing squad. So again, I expect fully prosecutors to file their notice of intent to seek the death penalty. Now, they have 60 days to do so from that initial arraignment, which will happen tomorrow. So expect to get that notice in a matter of days or weeks. When the president of the United States and the governor of Utah are both saying that they believe that Tyler Robinson should get the death penalty, I expect prosecutors to file that notice. So then then it goes to the defense. What are they going to try to do in this case, Andy? Do they try to defend the case on the merits and actually try to get a not guilty? I think that's going to be incredibly difficult because of all the video we've seen. Now we know there's DNA, there's some admissions on Discord, maybe a confession of family member. What I expect them to do is shift and try to move to the penalty phase and try to save his life. Talk about some of the factors in mitigation, like him turning himself in, for instance. The fact that he's only 22, has no criminal history, and he comes from a Mormon family, which is, I think, is going to resonate with some of those jurors there in Utah. So that's what I expect the defense to do. And obviously, the prosecution, they're going to focus on how this was premeditated, an assassination. There's no legal or moral justification for this, and it was done for political reasons. So I think that's going to be the big argument in this case. Not does Robinson get off, but what the sentence will be in this case.
Yeah, a lot of people obviously calling for the death penalty, and it might lead to that direction. I do want to ask you about some of the evidence and maybe some of the more information that will get out as charges are being filed. But of course, Kash Patel, FBI director, saying there's DNA linking them. We also spoke with the Washington Post reporter that talked about how he appeared to confess on the online platform Discord about saying that he did shoot Charlie Kirk. How solid is that of a confession for prosecutors to have a confession on a social platform like that?
It's very strong. Anytime you can use the defendant's own words against him, you have an advantage as the prosecution. Now, reportedly, he hasn't been cooperating since he's been in custody. But if you look at what he did before and immediately after the murders, you have those admissions on Discord. Apparently, he's talking to folks about Kirk a lot. Today, they said he was obsessed with him, and I think that's based on his own words and some of his search history there. And again, to the extent that he actually confessed to his father or a priest or someone who was with the marshals, that's all evidence that's going to be used at trial. So again, I think it's going to be very difficult for Robinson to argue it wasn't me when you have all this evidence, the biometrics, the surveillance, these admissions. I think we're likely going to see a defense on the mitigation and to try to save his life.
Yeah, the mountain of evidence continues to grow higher, and we're looking at a live picture as lawmakers hold a vigil there in Washington, D.C. But as you mentioned, tomorrow the charges likely expected to be filed against the suspect, Tyler Robinson. What more information do you hope we glean tomorrow? What information could we get tomorrow from this hearing?
I think what everyone wants to know is what was Tyler Robinson's motive? And there's been some information, maybe some misinformation that's been out. Now, it's hard to get inside the mind of a killer. Obviously, we know that Charlie Kirk was beloved, but he was also somewhat polarizing political figure. So that seems to be the most logical reason. But in some cases, you never know. I don't think we really know, for instance, why Brian Koberger killed those 4 Idaho college students. The motive isn't an element of the crime. It's not something the prosecution has to prove. But folks who are watching and the jurors, they want to know, why would someone young, why would they do something like this, plot and plan this execution? So I think the more evidence that comes out, especially what Robinson said to others, I think that's going to be part of the evidence that I think people who are watching want to know, because they really want to know the motivation and to get inside the mind of a killer.
Yeah, how he got to this point exactly. Of course, even President Trump was talking about his upbringing, saying he was potentially a great student that led to this. So, Neama Rahmani, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, your insight here on Live Now from Fox.
Of course, Andy. Great talking to you as always.
All right, thank you so much. All right, great conversation as always here on Live Now. As plenty more of information is the shooting suspect, conservative activist Charlie Kirk, potentially could be in court tomorrow. The official charges being filed, and just as we say,